Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello to all my beautiful black diamonds of the earth, all the black people of the world. Welcome to another edition of Black Talk Radio, where black media matters and black life definitely matters. Today is Wednesday, September 26, 2018. Family, this video is about white privilege and what it really is. Well, that's according to the author, Cory Collins, who says, recognizing white privilege begins with truly recognizing the term itself. This video, or this story rather, by Cory Collins is out of the magazine called Teaching Tolerance. It's not a magazine that I subscribe to, but as I saw this magazine on a colleague's desk, I asked if I could review it because there was an article I wanted to read, especially when I saw the words white privilege. And so with that, I went into the article and I want to share it with you. So what is white privilege? Well, white privilege is, perhaps most notably in this era of uncivil discourse, a concept that has fallen victim to its own connotations. The two-word term packs a double whammy that inspires a pushback. One, the word white creates discomfort among those who are not used to being defined or described by their race. And two, the word privilege, especially for poor and rural white people, sounds like a word that doesn't belong to them, like a word that suggests they have never struggled. This defensiveness derails the conversation. White privilege is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled. In fact, the author says white privilege should be viewed as a built-in advantage, separate from one's level of income or effort. Frances E. Kendall, author of Diversity in the Classroom and Understanding White Privilege, Creating Pathways to Authentic Relationships Across Race, comes close to giving us an encompassing definition, which reads, quote, having greater access to power and resources than, and they say the word people of color, and I'm gonna not say that, so just know that I'm going to be using the term black every time I see them use the term people of color. So just know that ahead of time. So anyways, it says, having greater access to power and resources than black people in the same situation do. But in order to grasp what this means, it's also important to consider how the definition of white privilege has changed over time. So white privilege through the years. People like Peggy McIntosh began to view white privilege as being more psychological, subconscious advantage perpetuated by white people's lack of awareness that they held this power. White privilege could be found in a day-to-day transactions and in white people's ability to move through the professional and personal worlds with relative ease. And this is what they fail to realize, or at least pretend to fail to realize. The more complicated truth: white privilege is both unconsciously enjoyed and consciously perpetuated. It is both on the surface and deeply embedded into American life. It is a weightless knapsack and a weapon. It depends on who's carrying it. So, white privilege as the, quote, power of normal. Sometimes the examples used to make white privilege visible to those who have it are also the examples least damaging to those who lack it. But that doesn't mean these examples do not matter or that they do not do any damage at all. These privileges are symbolic of what we call, quote, the power of normal. If public spaces and goods seem catered to one race and segregate the needs of black people of other races into special sections, that indicates something beneath the surface. White people become more likely to move through the world with an expectation that their needs be readily met, while black people move through the world knowing their needs are on the margin. Recognizing this means recognizing where gaps exist. So, white privilege as the power of the benefit of the doubt. The power of normal goes beyond the local CVS. White people are also more likely to see positive portrayals of people who look like them on the news, on TV shows, and in movies. They are more likely to be treated as individuals rather than as representatives for the exceptions to a stereotypical racial identity. In other words, they are more often humanized and granted the benefit of the doubt. Isn't that so true? They are more likely to receive compassion, to be granted individual potential to survive mistakes, i.e. Amber Geiger. But I digress. This has negative effects for black people who, without this privilege, face the consequences of racial profiling, stereotypes, and lack of compassion for their struggles. In these scenarios, white privilege includes the facts that, quote, white people are less likely to be followed, interrogated, or searched by law enforcement because they look, quote, suspicious. White people's skin tone will not be a reason people hesitate to trust their credit or financial responsibility. We see this all the time. If white people are accused of a crime, they are less likely to be presumed guilty, less likely to be sentenced to death, and more likely to be portrayed in a fair, nuanced manner by media outlets, i.e. Amber Geiger. So the personal faults or missteps of white people will likely not be used to later deny opportunities or compassion to people who share their racial identity. This privilege is invisible to many white people because it seems reasonable to a person should be extended compassion as they move through the world. It seems logical that a person should have the chance to prove themselves individually before they are judged. It's supposedly an American ideal. But it's a privilege often not granted to black people with dire consequences. Did you hear that, white people? This is a white privilege. These are white privileges that we're talking about here. Okay? For example, programs like New York City's now abandoned stop and frisk policy. New York's abandoned stop and frisk policy targeted a disproportionate number of black and Latino people. Blacks are more likely to be arrested for drug offenses despite using at a similar rate to white people. Some people do not survive these stereotypes. In 2017, black people who were unarmed and not attacking anyone were more likely to be killed by police. A study conducted in Australia, which has its own hard history of subjugating black and indigenous people, perfectly illustrates how white privilege can manifest in day-to-day interactions. In the experiment, people of different racial and ethnic identities tried to board public buses, telling the driver they didn't have enough money to pay for the ride. Researchers documented more than 1,500 attempts. The results? 72% of white people were allowed to stay on the bus. Only 36% of black people were extended the same kindness. Just as people of color, or just as black people did nothing to deserve this unequal treatment, white people did not earn disproportionate access, access to compassion and fairness. They receive it as the byproduct of systemic racism and bias. And even if they are not aware of it in their daily lives as they walk along the streets, this privilege is the result of conscious choices made long ago and choices still being made today. So, white privilege as the power of accumulated power. Perhaps the most important lesson about white privilege is the one that's taught the least. Quote, the power of normal and the power of the benefit of the doubt are not just subconscious remnants of historical discrimination. They are the purposeful results of racism, and they allow for the continuous recreation of inequality. These powers would not exist if systemic racism hadn't come first. And systemic racism cannot endure unless those powers still hold sway. McIntosh asked herself an important question that inspired her famous essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. On a daily basis, what do I have that I didn't earn? Question mark. Our work should include asking the two looming follow-up questions. Who built that system? Who keeps it going? That's right, those are two important questions. Who built that system? Who keeps it going? The answers to those questions could fill several books, but they produce examples of white privilege that you won't find in many broad explainer pieces. For example, the ability to accumulate wealth has long been a white privilege, created by overt systemic racism in both the public and private sectors. In 2014, the Pew Research Center released a report that revealed the average net worth of white household was $141,900. For Black and Hispanic households, that dropped to $11,000 and $13,700 respectively. These numbers, family, that I'm spewing out right now are done and exposed through the Pew Research Center. Now, and that was done in 2014. I gotta tell you, these numbers are staggering. They are a testament to the racism that exists in this country, and it just goes to show America has never, ever, ever been great. It's been a hypocrisy. The democracy has been a hypocrisy, but it's never, ever, ever been great. But I digress. The gap is huge, and the great equalizers don't narrow it. Research from Brandeis University and Demos found that the racial wealth gap is not closed when Black people attend college, when they work full time, or when they spend less and save more. None of those things seem to close the gaps, as white people always try to portray. It's all propaganda from their system. It's how they maintain their system by giving you those types of baits, because that's all it is. The gap, instead, depends largely on inheritance, wealth passed from one generation to the next, and that wealth often comes in the form of inherited homes. When white families are able to accumulate wealth because of their earning power or home value, they are more likely to be able to support their children into adulthood, helping with expenses such as college education, first cars, and first homes. The cycle continues. So let me pause for a second there, family. When white people constantly say things like get a job and go to school, get an education, all these things, they're just deflections. It's how they make themselves feel better about the racist system they have set up in their favor. That's all it is. Because it's been revealed and exposed that the things that they say is what will help us is all a lie. They're lying. But I digress. You see, family, this is a privilege denied to many black families, a denial that started with the work of public leaders and property managers. After World War II, when the GI Bill provided white veterans with, quote, a magic carpet to the middle class, unquote, racist zoning laws segregated towns and cities with sizable populations of, guess who? Black people. From Baltimore to Birmingham, from New York to St. Louis, from Louisville to Oklahoma City, to Chicago to Austin, and in cities beyond and in between. This is the system white racists set up. And they claim they want to make America great again. The result? Black people weren't allowed to raise their children and invest their money in neighborhoods with high home values. The cycle continues today. Before the 2008 crash, black people were disproportionately targeted for subprime mortgages, and neighborhood diversity continues to correlate with low property values across the United States. According to the Century Foundation, 1/4 of black Americans living in poverty live in high poverty neighborhoods. Only 1 in 13 impoverished white Americans lives in a high poverty neighborhood. Why mention these issues in an article defining white privilege, you ask? Because the past and present context of wealth inequality serves as a perfect example of white privilege. Did you get that? Because the past and present context of white inequality, because the past and present context of wealth inequality serves as a perfect example of white privilege. I know Dr. Boyce, if he hears this, or he hears me say that term, I know, would probably agree to that point. He speaks a lot about black wealth, and I listen to him quite often because he speaks a lot of good information. Anyways, this example of white privilege also illustrates how systemic inequities trickle down to less harmful versions of white privilege. Wealth inequity contributes to the power of the benefit of the doubt. Every time a white person is given a lower mortgage rate than a black person with the same credit credentials, wealth inequity reinforces the power of normal. Every time businesses assume their most profitable consumer base is the white base and adjust their products accordingly. You see, this is all white privilege that you guys take advantage of, you take for granted, and or you deny and deflect on. And this example of white privilege serves as an important purpose. It recenters the power of consciousness choices or conscious choices in the conversation about what white privilege is. That's right, it recenters the power of conscious choices in the conversation about what white privilege is. People can be ignorant about these inequities, of course. According to the Pew Research Center, only 46% of white people say that they benefit a great deal or a fair amount from advantages that society does not offer to black people. But conscious choices were and are made to uphold these privileges, and this goes beyond loan officers and lawmakers. Multiple surveys have shown that many white people support the idea of racial equality, but are less supportive of policies that can make it more possible, such as reparations, affirmative action, or law enforcement reform. Now, when I first read that, I found that awfully odd that white people don't even want law enforcement reform. Oh, but that's because they know the police are getting away with murder. They know that police are getting away with what they term justifiable homicide, which is an oxymoron. God is surely going to punish you for that. But lastly, well, you see, in that way, white privilege is not just the power to find what you need in a convenience store or to move through the world without your race defining your interactions. It's not just the subconscious comfort of seeing a world that serves you as normal. It's also the power to remain silent in the face of racial inequity. It's the power to weigh the need for protest or confrontation against the discomfort or inconvenience of speaking up. It's getting to choose when and where you want to take a stand. It's knowing that you and your humanity are safe. And what a privilege that is. Got white privilege? Thanks a lot for tuning in to Black Talk Radio, where black media matters. This is your host, Guru, and that will conclude this subject on white privilege. I hope you gained something out of this subject matter. Peace out.